And we are live, except for that nobody can hear me because I have my mic muted. There we go. Hopefully everybody can hear me a little bit better now. But yeah, it wouldn't be my normal stream if something didn't go awry. So that's all right.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody. Go ahead. No, you go for it.
Oh, well, look, it makes things much more fun, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. Welcome to Coffee and Conversation, everybody. Tom Ravlic is with us again this evening, and we will be talking about extremism and the media. Real quick, everybody, Red is out for the evening. He was in a car accident several weeks ago. All of you tuning in that knew that happened, and so he's got some recovery time. So it's just me and Tom tonight. But don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And also, if you're a Amazon Prime member, you can subscribe to my Twitch channel for free. So with all ado, I will turn it over to Tom.
Oh, we're turning it all over to me, are we?
We are.
Look, I think you and to those people who haven't read your piece that appears on the Beyond Barriers website, there's some interesting material that you've written about far-right messaging and the art of political marketing.
Yes.
But there's one paragraph that I thought we could start the discussion on, because you talk about the nature of propaganda and the fact that people think about propaganda and politics and not necessarily products. And it might be convenient to begin at that point, because it interests me that we associate the word propaganda with politics. But what we forget is that that tends to be a pejorative association. It tends to be a word used negatively.
Absolutely.
But when you talk about the communication product, you're looking at something that is communication with a purpose. Now, for those watching, what we're probably going to try and do in the next little while is strip back some of the rubbish that's spoken about in political communication, simply because political communication is now designed to get an emotional reaction one way or another.
Right.
And when you look at the sort of communication that people do generally in politics, and even more so in the extreme space, it is pandering to certain trigger points. And those trigger points can be anything. It can be nationalist trigger points. They can be racial trigger points. They can be any sort of trigger points. But what they're trying to do is hit at things. Now, I've analysed this stuff over the years in various different contexts. Acacia's had the practical experience of dealing with it. Now, when we go to the article, by the way, Acacia, when you talked about products, what did you mean about products specifically? Before we go wandering elsewhere, because I know that's what we're going to end up doing.
Right. A lot of it is like, as far as the propaganda would be concerned, and my brain just went completely blank. Can you repeat the question? I totally got it, and then I got sidetracked. I'm sorry. See, I told you, it's one of those nights that it just goes.
That's okay. That's fine. It's all good. When you talk about products in terms of propaganda, what did you mean about products? How did that sort of evolve in the back of your mind?
Essentially, with propaganda and like products and advertising, I mean, a lot of advertising could be dents into the propaganda as well. But as far as like products, I mean, it could be anything from your hair care product to nails to microphone to really anything, because essentially what you were trying to do is you're trying to sell something. So when you put that into propaganda with, say, an extremist organization, an extremist movement, an extremist ideology, you're still essentially trying to sell something. So, and a lot of people, I don't think, really take that into consideration. They take it more like, oh, well, this is evil, horrible, and you're just trying to sell an idea, but they don't realize that the exact same way that you would sell any kind of a product is essentially the same way that you sell an idea. If that makes sense.
In effect, you're selling an idea to move a product. I mean, if you look at underarm deodorant, there's always going to be a certain association with underarm deodorant. I don't know why I mentioned underarm deodorant, by the way. There are certain things that go with the advertising. Underarm deodorant makes you more desirable to whoever. Apparently, if you believe the television ads, I'm not sure it works in practice, but I've tried. And it's the same with food. I mean, if you look at various campaigns for McDonald's, for example, at various points in time, they dress up takeaway food to be something else, in order to get you through the building, into the building, and buy the product. Okay,
right.
So that's what you've got, and that's what you kind of cover up in the article, which I encourage people to read.
Right. Real quick, Death of Certainty just commented and said, underarm deodorant? I mean, that's my secret to the ladies.
Okay. I will take that on board and consider it. Consider it next time I go shopping. Okay.
That's awesome.
That's done me in for the next 10 minutes. But right? I've had an episode in this episode as well, so that's okay.
It's all good.
Well, it's all good. You led earlier on, and I'm merely following. But if we go back into the sort of the extremist mode or politics generally, the interesting thing for me is not so much what people say, but the fact that those who are seeing what is being said haven't even thought about why certain forums and certain mechanisms are used to get them worked up. For example, earlier this year, there was a far-right group that went into the Grampians, which is a national park area, did what they did, yelled the usual slogans, and sort of got media coverage.
Of course.
What then happened was different groups that view slogans that are used by far-right groups as being obscene and offensive and harking back to various different political regimes that have been in existence over the past centuries or so. They got upset, and then they got media coverage. And then the group that prompted this outrage then got more media coverage. And people are triggered by that. Now, as an observer, I looked at the coverage, and I thought, yes, it's very natural for that to happen. And for those who don't know, I've actually studied terrorist propaganda and the propaganda of various organizations. So when that comes up, on television, I just shrug and
Right.
I just shrug. There we go again. Other people who are perhaps not as cognizant of what's being done to push their buttons
Right.
end up buying into the flow of discourse.
Yep.
Until they're told, oh, by the way, somebody is having a lend of you.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody is actually pulling you into a discourse, not because their intention is to offend you necessarily, but that's the effect. But you're actually the proxy for them to get publicity. You're the road. You're the conduit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I don't think is readily appreciated. But I mean, you've seen it from the inside. How does it? Have I described it correctly, Acacia?
Oh, completely. And I know Jeff has made oh, sorry. Death is Certainty was saying, so this is about how the media monetizes extremism, and I just told him it was extremism and how the media perpetuates it, which is the same thing. But from being on the inside, one thing that they would say is that any media coverage is good coverage. So even bad coverage is good coverage, much like the group down there in Australia, and the gentleman wanted to have his voice heard. They refused to let him have his voice heard. And so then it became a big scene. And then suddenly, because of the big scene, yeah, it was negative, but he gained an immense amount of followers overnight. He became a celebrity overnight. Now, mind you, I would never recommend anybody go and do stupid things, but having the coverage, even if it's negative, it still is covering. It's still getting your face out there. And the thing is that a lot of things, I know, at least with like the group that I was a part of, somebody had once said that it's shock value. And I think you and I had mentioned it before. We were talking how a lot of times with media, you can say certain things and you know it's going to be triggering. And then in that sense, you've just won yourself a spot on the 5 o'clock news because you intentionally triggered somebody.
I've just so the viewers don't think I'm ignoring Acacia, I'm looking for, which I would never do. I am looking for some data because around the time the events that I'm talking about actually transpired, I started tracking certain accounts on sort of social media.
Right.
And if I go to early March, where a particular individual had 5,008 subscribers on Telegram.
Wow.
The next day after the first night of coverage, it jumped up to 1,489. It then on the third day after the second time, so first night of coverage, it went up, by almost 1,500, right? And then it went another 1,000 or so, and by the end of the week, it went from 5,008 to, one second, let me just swing my monitor around, to 8,314.
So it jumped over 3,000.
So yeah, in that week,
Just a week.
Yep. Just within that week, it went from 5,008 to 8,314. You go into the Saturday after the 2 nights of coverage, 8,464, 8,606 to the Sunday, the 7th of March.
Wow.
And it just moved very, very rapidly. Now, if you let's break this down, hypothesize a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The normal the normal logic that people apply here is you don't you don't platform individuals or organisations, otherwise they'll get more publicity.
Right.
However, um, the relevant network did take video of from different sources of the individual concerned,
Hmm.
but they didn't talk to the individual directly because that would be platforming the individual.
Right.
Had they sought an interview with the individual, I think they could have edited the interview
Yep.
appropriately. Um, that is, still find a piece that fit within the narrative of why people do what they do,
Hmm.
and not necessarily spewing all of the propaganda that's usually associated with certain
Right.
extreme political movements. Right? Would a second night of coverage have been necessary? I would argue no,
Yeah.
because you would have cauterized the thing in one point.
Exactly.
What it then does, what the coverage show then does is, yeah, you broadcast once, someone gets upset, they're not spoken to, a scene's created, a second night of coverage happens, and guess what? There's a spike
Yep.
in attention. So sometimes the logic that applies to don't platform someone might actually be might actually not work as cleanly
Yep.
as people would like, and I think
Well,
that merits reflection.
oh, absolutely. I've told people before, like when they started, obviously I was still involved with the extremism at that point, when they started um, deplatforming from social media, deplatforming from credit cards, like making it difficult to hold a job, doxing, all of those things. And I understand the concept of not wanting to give people a voice to spew hatred and their their rhetoric and everything else. However, much like you said, had they just initially given an interview, they're the company, they can edit to it to however they would like it to go. But had they just done that and let him have his voice, whether or not it aired would have been irrelevant because they could have done it and said, no, I'm not going to, air it. But had they just done that, it would have most likely, obviously we can't say for certain, but most likely it would not have turned into the big upheaval that it had. And I've told people before, I understand not wanting to hear the hateful rhetoric. I understand, thinking how deplatforming is going to help. But the problem also is that if you ignore a problem, it won't go away. And my thing has always been, you're deplatforming people. You're trying to take away their voice. Stop giving them reasons to scream.
Mm-hmm.
Because by trying to ignore it, you're actually making the problem bigger. And these groups then can come around and say, see, look, we were right. They want to silence us all. See, they don't want to hear from us. See, they're silencing you. And it gives validity to said grievances that might not otherwise had any validity.
And it probably hardens the resolve of people. Now I've got there's a question that's come up about far right groups in Australia, and I think we can sort of make this a little bit more general. Um, there is a bit of sort of activity that is obvious and public, but it's clear that our security agencies, like the Australian Intelligence and Security Organisation, have been doing a bit more work than they have in the past, looking at far right connections and uh, how these groups work. ASIO with the Victorian Police, um, submitted to a parliamentary inquiry, which is running now, and you can go freely look at the Australian Parliament's website to look at their submissions. But in essence, what is happening is similar to what's happening elsewhere, and that is there are people who are young, they're impressionable. They tend to be in their early to mid-20s on average. In some cases, they're almost exclusively male, and they are recruiting people who are younger. Now, if we can, the particular group that's made news down here because of all the activity they've done, released their activist manual online, and they released it because a former member released a copy they held to another organisation. And then they went into the process of doxing the individual online as a person who had leaked what was deemed to be a confidential document of the group, and that in its own right is interesting because once you read it, there was nothing in that manual that would have been unknown to people who understood or studied how clandestine organisations operate. There are certainly in the past been other groups that have merged and connected back before. If you go looking through various reports online, you'll see names like Antipodean Resistance, the United Patriots Front, and others who've essentially been then merged and gone elsewhere, involving a lot of the same people. By the way, it's not that the core leadership has generally changed. It's that the groups have morphed into different kinds of organisations, and there have been people who've done that research here in Australia and monitored how people have moved. But it's so different to what's happened elsewhere. You've seen it in the US when groups get a lot of attention and a lot of law enforcement attention, then they tend to quieten down. In some cases, they might disband, or they might disband and then attempt to rebrand.
Right. Which has happened a lot.
It's happened. It can happen quite a bit, and then that simply is that sort of shape-shifting mode that people adopt. It doesn't mean they won't be noticed by intelligence services and others, because there are ways in which recruitment, for example, is monitored. And it's clear that there are certain groups, by the way, from the last time we spoke, it's been noticed online that there are certain accounts that can no longer be accessed on, say, an Apple device.
Yep.
What's happened clearly is that the versions of apps like Telegram that can be downloaded from iTunes or from Google Play, somehow there's been a technological block being placed on certain accounts. And quite clearly, there's one group that I'm thinking of right now, you can't see their content on an iPhone. And you can't search it properly on your desktop version of Telegram.
Right.
And that was not the case 3 months ago, or 6 months ago, 9 months ago, 12 months ago. It's clear that people have been taking action to minimize attempt to minimize the visibility. It doesn't mean that you can't find it if you then you're in Telegram and you scroll through goodness knows how many weeks of posts to find the relevant link, and then you go and find out what the latest posts are. But what is clear is that the very organisations that Go Mental, who's asked the question, is talking about, have been monitored, have had action taken against them by specific platforms. That doesn't mean that their ability to communicate is crushed. It means that the
Yeah.
name on which the name by which they're known can't be searched, and therefore the ability to grow on those accounts specifically is minimized.
Or they think it is. That is one thing that a lot of people don't realize. When I was involved, I was a propagandist, and this is right at the point at which Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of these were deplatforming white nationalists and white nationalist groups. I got them back on Facebook. I got them back on Twitter because I changed the cover of the book. And as long as you leave those little breadcrumbs, because people think that once you deplatform, that's the end of the story. They'll just shut up and go away. No, they get more creative and find ways around it. You know, am I proud of the fact that I got them on Facebook and all of that? Absolutely not. But for me personally, at that point in time, it was more of a challenge to say, okay, you think you got us? Let's see what we can do now. And these groups are getting more and more creative. They are using, there's one link that I put in there from the gman.net. On some of these Telegram channels, you will find this group actually used media coverage in their recruitment video. Media coverage combined with them themselves defacing George Floyd memorials and murals and stuff like that. And I was telling somebody the other day, I said, you know, because when I showed it to somebody that works with us here at Beyond Barriers, they were like, oh, well, that's just news coverage. I said, no, watch it till the end. They used the negative news coverage, combined it into a recruitment video. And you're finding these a lot more. You know, you're finding, in one sense, I would say media blackout can be a good thing. But it goes back to the whole thing that they're going to use whatever coverage they can, positive or negative, to twist it around to fit their narrative. And it doesn't go away. I believe we were talking about this was after the show the last time, how a lot of times media inflates things, and there's such a mysterious or a mystery around certain things that if they had left it alone, such as the one guy, had they just given him an interview, they could have used it, not used it, whatever. It would have completely avoided it. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I know what I'm trying to say, but
yeah, I know there are ways of managing an issue without it overflowing. Now, one of the things that this prompts me to raise, and those of you that are sort of online and want to jump on after the episode and look for a paper by an academic from Israel called Boaz Ganor in Perspectives on Terrorism. And he looks at what makes extremists take action. And he proposes a bathtub model. You know, it's actually really fascinating that he raises a new model to look at, you know, how people get to a point where they take action on beliefs. And I thought it was fascinating that he called it a bathtub model. Who would have thought that you'd get an idea in a hardware store? But there we are. But if you sit back and think about all of the factors that come into being, for example, the grievances and people not listening or not paying attention or whatever it happens to be, all these things build up and something eventually breaks, right? Something eventually causes an overflow of the bathtub. So I thought it was a fascinating analogy to use as a sort of way of thinking, a thought provoker to play with that kind of stuff. So it's worthwhile having a look at that kind of thing when you're thinking about the phenomena that you're viewing around you. It could be almost anything. It could be, what causes the people who are involved in anti-government militias to go out on the march. What
Right.
causes people who are QAnon types to just spew a whole heap of stuff on Twitter as a stream of consciousness. I've seen that happen before. And I won't say it's particularly fascinating, but it's interesting, but not so fascinating that it causes me to go to the end of the thread every time I see it happen, because it's like watching a repeat of an old television program. It all tends to be the same. But yeah, using things as thought-provoking tools or theories, you get to unravel how things work. We've also had an issue not so long ago with a major network in Australia reporting on QAnon,
Yep.
and there was a discourse about whether an individual who had a friendship with a politician or connected to a politician was actually a national security threat. And I scratched my head and I thought, hold on, wait a minute, how does that become a national security threat in Australia? In the US, you might find it that way because US has very different laws to do with gun control, for example.
Right.
There are some groups, as I understand it, in the United States, when they hear the term gun control, they go absolutely apoplectic.
Yes.
Okay, so you've
You're
got
not
that.
going to take my guns. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
But in Australia, it's a completely different scenario. So you need to, when we use the terminology related to that, we do need to be careful that there's a way in which we measure, we apply a measured tone, apply a nuanced tone to media coverage, because not everything people think is a national security threat actually is.
Right.
And in that scenario, the Four Corners program, which people can go to, abc.net.au, you can look it up. I think it's a Great Awakening, I think is the title of it from memory, but you'll find it quite easily. And what is really bizarre is when you watch that program and you observe it from somewhat objectively, and you see the posts that were sent between two individuals being reported. All I saw was a couple of people talking each other up. One said he knew stuff, the other one said he knew somebody who that stuff could be passed on to. And I didn't see a national security threat. I just saw a couple of people big noting themselves.
Right.
And that, I think, is but it then turns into a major national security story, and I scratched my head and I've gone, how? Two people on the fringes big noting themselves turns into a major national security item. Really? Right. Okay. All right. Carry on. But which leads me to another point as well in that scenario, and more generally, that same edition of Perspectives on Terrorism that I referred to also has an interesting article by two prominent authorities on extremism, so radicalization rather, Sofia Moskalenko and Clark McCauley, and they look at QAnon.
Mm.
And what they basically say is, yes, the ideas are they're kind of interesting, for
Hmm.
want of a euphemism, but you've got two choices in policing. You've got two choices in looking at this stuff. You can deal with the issue as a policing of radical opinion, which they argue against, because
Right.
you'll be wasting your time.
Hmm.
Just because people have bad ideas doesn't mean that they're going to act on them.
Correct.
Okay.
I believe you wrote an article kind of along the same lines, didn't you? Just recently for
Yeah,
Crikey.
I wrote a piece
That's it.
for a publication called The Mandarin,
That's
which
one.
is
Yeah.
a publication targeted towards the sort of the government sector and bureaucrats and um, the political establishment here. And I deliberately did that because there were people who were around the place who were playing up the significance a bit more. Coming back to the Moskalenko and Macaulay paper,
Right.
um, they advocate, and I guess I agree with their logic, that you need to police radical action. That is, you need to police and prevent radical action or things happening that result in bad things happening to others.
Right.
So that's where Macaulay and Moskalenko get to. But
Mm.
generally speaking, whenever there's an idea people don't like, a bit like the sort of culture wars or cancel culture, we can
Right.
use the modern phrase. I think those words are somewhat misused. They're weaponized in every second opportunity. Certain conservative commentators get in this country. Everything the result of cancel culture. No, everything the result of people actually not sitting back and reflecting on issues
Right.
um, a bit more and using these little things on impulse.
Right.
Right? The reason why we get into trouble today a little bit is that social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others trade off emotive response, instantaneous
Yep.
response, and we don't necessarily allow ourselves an opportunity to reflect about the wisdom of responding to something immediately.
Exactly.
Because the minute you respond to something immediately, what you then do is you create a situation where one person then decides to get a bit excited, perhaps, and engage with you. A person
Right.
might then and you might actually inflame other people, and it becomes a pile-on. I've had a couple of instances over the past 12 months where there were people who were trying to draw me into discussion online, and I thought, hold on a second. Um, One tick. How many followers has the person that's baiting me got?
Hmm.
How many have I got? Let's, for argument's sake, they've got 80 followers and I've got 8,000 or whatever it happens to be. Um, so, am I going to subject the 8,000 people that might follow me to the rubbish that someone who's only got 80 followers has put up? And
Right.
therefore, nonsense is spread to, at a minimum, 8,080 people. If they then incorporate a hashtag in that and I respond to it, goodness knows how many people, other than the 8,080 who I've mistakenly entered into a discussion with because I've let some idiot get under my skin.
Yep.
So,
See, and
yeah,
people don't think about these things. That's
no,
the
no,
thing. People are very reactionary. Like you said, I mean, it's there at the click of a button. And a lot of people don't stop to think, okay, wait a minute. For one, somebody's baiting me. Two, how is that going to reflect on your followers? And, is it, sorry, Death of Certainty said, checks his followers, feels personally attacked. Smiley face. Sorry, I just saw that as I was talking. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, you lose your train of thought, but given that it's the express line, it'll come back around shortly.
It will.
But
It will eventually.
it'll eventually come back here that multiple trains every 10 minutes. But if it's a very busy line. The the way in which social media then propagates that. I mean, we saw on Facebook at one point during the pandemic here that people who were sovereign citizens, sovereign citizen types, who protested against government directives and health directives and all that sort of thing, and the usual twaddle about the government is a corporation and a corporation doesn't set law. Therefore, you can pick and choose whether you can wear a face mask. No, that's absolute rubbish. The only place you get to choose stuff is when you go to a restaurant and there's a smorgasbord, right? Everything else has got consequences.
Every action there is an equal or greater reaction. Consequence.
Absolutely. So we had a lot of that last year, and there were still some people who decide to get their weekly exercise from time to time and gather in groups and carry on and say we don't want this thing. This is and something that impacts on our liberties and our freedoms, etc., etc., etc.
Yep.
All the while, sort of trying to convince people that coronavirus is caused by 5G or something else.
Wait, it wasn't. Sorry, I couldn't help it.
I figured that. It's okay. We'll get back to normal transmission shortly. But if we take, your host has lost it for a moment. It's okay. She'll be back soon.
It's all good.
It's fine. But if you take it in terms of social media and how people reach out, the thing that troubles me about social media, and it's wonderful, but it is usually the people who are the most extreme and the most outrageous and the most ridiculous that get the attention.
Right.
So I can't recall the precise number of Twitter users that Twitter's got, but geez, there's a lot of people in this. Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, let's just take a lot as being the sample I'm talking about here. But there's a lot of people who are purportedly adults who get on social media who behave like a 5-year-old in the confectionery aisle of a supermarket screaming like mad, wanting a bar of chocolate. I have no idea how we get the adult population of the US, Australia, and the UK and the Europe combined behaving like, infants in the confectionery aisle.
Yep.
And that's what's going on.
Oh, yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, they might wear big people clothes, but they're behaving like a 5-year-old.
Yep. Well, and you find that even in the professional field, surprisingly enough, even on Twitter is like one of the worst places for it. But, you'll find people in there that are supposed to be professional, like you said, acting like 5-year-olds, throwing a temper tantrum. And it's normal.
It's actually amusing when you sit back and you observe people who are the custodians of language.
Right.
And you think, let me just go and check your LinkedIn profile. You did what? A journalism degree? Okay, cool. So you did a journalism degree and you can't find another word to use in the English language based on your qualification other than an expletive? Okay. Fine.
Oh, yeah.
Very educated lot. supposedly.
Right.
Yeah, lack of critical thinking says go mental. Yes, there is an absence of critical thinking. I think you nail it absolutely, because what we also have is the ability of, and yes, social media does incentivize that kind of behavior, because that's the kind of behavior that triggers people.
Yep.
Okay, so somebody swears automatically, someone half thinking with their phone or with the Twitter app turns around and said, "Oh, hold on, you swore. Be civil. Why should I be civil?" Says somebody who might have an anonymous Twitter handle,
Right.
at completeidiot.com. The at completeidiot.com turned around and said, "Well, nobody knows who I am. It's okay."
Right.
Right? But
Actually,
no.
I'm going to stop you just for 1 second. Go ahead and complete that thought. I need to grab another coffee, but I can still hear. So
Okay,
I'll be
well,
right back.
I'll just keep on going, because
All right.
um, one of the big issues, and I'm talking with the empty chair at the moment, which is fine. But one of the key issues in terms of communication and social media, which I think is the point where we probably need to explore as well, is that people sometimes forget, especially if they're professionals, that from time to time, people you might want to apply to work for actually look at your social media account. Um, and having too much material that looks like you've got the capacity to be spicy in the public domain may not assist you further down the track, even though people use the fig leaf of views are my own. Well, yeah, that's okay. We know you've got your own views, but you need to express them that way, firstly. Um, Secondly, the big issue also is how those views articulate with what you do for a living. Now, in the world of journalism, there's one thing that I think professionals like me need to reflect on a bit more, and that is we are in a position um, where yes, I'm just seeing. You usually listen to the show with Jeff. Yes, I've actually had the
Ah,
privilege of I've actually had the privilege of interviewing Jeff 3 times on the record, which has been
it's been a
both
lot of fun.
but it's been an education as well as being uh, uh, quite entertaining at points. But coming back to, it's always good to look at chat. You get confused. Um,
Right.
but I know
That's the
what
cool thing
happened.
about live streaming.
Yeah, live entertainment, you get confused. The the other thing that people do need to bear in mind about social media and keeping it civil is that you never quite know who's watching.
Yep. It's very true.
Um, you never quite know who's watching, and the journalists, I think, are in the bad habit of trying to, uh, in some respects, segregate their social media activity from their professional activity. I don't think the audience cares whether you've got a personal view or your professional work. Your
Mm-hmm.
professional work is distinct from that.
Right.
I would love to see some research done on whether uh, people look at a journalist's Twitter view expressed on Twitter and then transpose that on the work they do that they argue is an independent account of something.
It
I've
doesn't
got
matter.
I've got a hunch that what's said on Twitter it acts as a contagion,
Yep.
has an impact on
Yep.
how people view the professional work done by a journalist.
Absolutely. It absolutely
Um,
does.
and the media establishment does need to reflect more broadly on that. Because if your work is being read in the context of your social media presence, I think you've got I think there's a problem for journalists. Now, some of them don't even say much on social media.
Which is probably better.
They publicize what they've written and they step back.
Mm-hmm.
And then they probably watch the free for all when people pile on abuse, to which they never respond. I mean, there's a high-profile journalist in this country who has told me that what they end up doing is muting notifications on Twitter. In other words, if people feel it's cathartic to abuse someone on Twitter, fine, but they've actually taken the step, probably from a practical standpoint, maybe even mental health standpoint, maybe even just because that's not the way they use Twitter itself, that there's a need for them to simply disassociate with the app while people are reacting. There's another, but then the very networks they work for also, have panel programs, for example.
Right.
Okay. They will deliberately put panelists on who are known for having provocative views. They're provocateurs, and then the Twitter crowd argues about the fact that these individuals are put on panels. And I watch this happen, and I treat Twitter, by the way, for those watching this stream, I treat Twitter as a spectator sport.
That's a good way to look at it, come to think of it.
I treat Twitter as a spectator sport. Why? Because it tells me about how people choose to behave online, and also tells me what triggers people online. So person A, who's a controversial personality, appears on a panel, and then there's this convergence of people saying, why are you putting them on again? They're this, they're that. And I'm thinking, you silly folks, if you shut up and you said nothing, they might not even put that person on in the next 6 months.
Yes.
Why? Because the reason they put people like that on the panel is in order to get you riled and to get you watching.
Get your reaction. Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you don't want to watch a panel with those people on it, get a television remote and switch it off. Don't give them the rating.
Technically, you could use your phone as a television remote if you have a smart TV, though.
Yeah, I do have a smart TV. I haven't allowed my television to do that just yet.
Probably a good idea. Sorry.
The problem I've got with the smart TV is if I'm talking on the phone,
it tries to pick it up.
Well, no, I mentioned something at one point, and then my Android-powered television decides to activate Ask Google, and I'm seeing answers to the conversation I'm having come up on screen. Now, that was not meant to happen.
That's why I refuse to use Alexa or any of those things. Anyways, that's a whole other conversation for another day.
But coming back to the whole concept of, and I'm seeing a comment about, is it truly social? Actually, no, it's not truly social, because how many of those things that you say to people on Twitter would you say if you had them in the room face to face?
They wouldn't. They'd run, or they'd stay silent.
I mean, how many of the people who swear at a Republican or a Democrat politician online would actually say that to them face to face?
Very few. I know of maybe a handful of people, but that's just because they're very outspoken and they just don't give a you-know-what. But your average person, if it's not behind a keyboard and a screen, they wouldn't say it.
Absolutely. So if you're talking about whether social media is really social, you need to reflect on what social dynamic you're thinking about and what you associate as being a social form of conduct or an appropriate conduct in the company of people.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
No, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, they are engagement platforms, but that doesn't mean we're being particularly social when we're using them. And also, the behavior is absolutely atrocious at
Right.
various points in time. Um, but as I said, television networks use people deliberately to spark reaction. Coming back to the original point, um,
Right.
and they will use people who might have extreme views on issues to get viewers and to engage. And if you're yelling and screaming and carrying on Twitter about person A, B, or C, you're delivering what people want. In the same
Mm-hmm.
way as people who respond to activity of certain groups in the community that sit on the fringes that are regarded as being extreme, the minute you respond a particular way, you're giving people what they want. And I mean,
Yep.
I, I, I don't know how you stop people feeding the beast, but I'm convinced that the beast that's being fed is overdue for a diet.
I would agree. And somebody had mentioned earlier about how, let me go scroll up here. How did he put it? Somebody said it, Death of Certainty actually said it. It's important to know who the bad guys are in the room, because then you know who not to expose your back to. And I would agree with that to a certain degree. Like, real journalism, real reporting is supposed to report on what is going on and things like that. But I know, like you and I have discussed before, like it's how you present it a lot of times that makes the big difference in the way you present it.
There's something else that's important here. And I think we need to mention it before we pull the plug on a session which has been good fun and quite enlightening at various points. But if you take the social media format, let's take Twitter. If you look at the way people think about public debate now, they keep on talking about deplatforming, muting, and blocking.
Mm-hmm.
At what point do we then talk about the fact that you cannot sanitize the ugliness that's out in the world in the same way as you can attempt to sanitize the ugliness, for want of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
in you know in the real world? So, for example, if you on social media, so if you're on Facebook and you're blocking everything related to X, Y, and Z, you're
Right.
getting to a point where you're sanitizing the world in the way you see it. If all of your screen time on a given day is spent on social media and you've sanitized the world, right? You think,
Right.
I've blocked so and so and so and so and so and so and so. They no longer kind of exist in my universe, but they exist somewhere else. You can't sanitize the ugliness of the world. You simply cannot. And the danger that we have is if people think they can just block everything and create the perfect world,
Yeah.
what happens to their capacity to be resilient when they're actually confronted by something out there? How do they deal with it? What sort of psychological state will they be in if they haven't had an exposure to something? If they haven't had a sort of like an educational period in their life where they understand their extreme views, or they've studied how you break down propaganda and how you look at language. That's the danger we face. And I don't know how you grapple with that, but the one thing I'm certain of, given some of the reactions I get from time to time on social media, is that there are people who have tailored their feeds to the point where they only see one thing when they're engaged in screen time.
Yep.
Okay?
Oh yeah.
And that to me is dangerous. It's about, I think that'd be the same intellectually as having fast food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and for snacks in the morning and afternoon.
Yep.
People talk about you being what you are, what you eat. It'd be the same with information. You are what you consume. So if you don't look at, say, far right columnists, people who tend to sit on the centre, people who are known as being a bit more progressive or left, if I can use that term, if you're not reading a combination of people, your
Yep.
ability to engage in broad critical thinking, as one of our participants today said earlier, um, and your ability to look at the world in widescreen is greatly diminished.
Yep. Well, you've just created your own echo chamber. Like we talk about at Beyond Barriers about echo chambers a lot. And the thing is you can have an echo chamber without it being like your personal echo chamber might not be negative, but how it becomes negative is because it limits your ability to respond and to interact with other people that might not think like you think. And it's very important, like you said, if you're, and it reminds me of this movie, I think it's called like Bubble Boy or something, but essentially like you have this entire bubble around you and you can't have the critical thinking anymore. You can't interact with other people anymore because you have limited yourself and you don't even know how to do that anymore.
No, I haven't read Coddling of the American Mind, but I'm certainly now going to look for it.
Look it up. Yes, definitely. I haven't read it either.
Funnily enough, I've got books that I need to have a good look at on a pile. Okay. It's the reason War Patrol is so important. That's right. As we said earlier, you cannot eliminate the ugliness of things. We've got a debate at the moment. In Australia, and also in America, as I gather from the feeds. And this is important to note. Both our countries have used people in Afghanistan as locally employed staff or locally employed employees, and there's a bunch of those folks at the moment who are waiting to be repatriated from there by the countries that have employed them, given that they're nervous that they will be treated very poorly as an advancing Taliban reaches the places they live. And people who are remote from that, who only watch reality television and other bits and pieces, won't understand the significance of that issue. Right? So you need to, from time to time, remind people that there are nasty things that happen in other parts of the world. The world is not an episode of American Idol or Big Brother or The Bachelor. I mean, we've got The Bachelor and Bachelorette here in Australia every year.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Your apologies are accepted. But and I mean, we've also got Farmer Gets a Wife in Australia, and then you got Married at First Sight in Australia. All that sort of stuff. My Twitter feed is full of people who watch that stuff. I don't have to watch it. I don't have to watch it.
You just
know,
read it.
I just see who the bad guy is by the way people swear about them. It's amazing how those programs get people all worked up when generally they're scripted in a load of rubbish, but never mind. But if you look at, coming back to Afghanistan, if you don't understand the reality of it, what's going on, whether it be in other parts of the Middle East or Afghanistan itself, you're not going to appreciate the gravity of the situation. I did an interview yesterday with someone who managed the Australian Embassy's facilities in Afghanistan, and I basically put it to him, well, it appears to me, given the state of play right now, that a Taliban bullet might actually be quicker than the Australian bureaucracy. And
which is sad but true.
which it's sad but true. But you've got to
Hmm.
actually put it that way to get people's attention.
Yeah.
So not being exposed to the realities, not being exposed to some elements of war photography. Some things are fairly graphic, and you don't want to be putting certain things on television.
Right. Right.
But you've really got to have an environment where people don't grow up in a sanitized environment, don't grow up in cotton wool, because that's not going to help anybody in the future.
Right. Oh yeah. I could not agree more with everything you just said, because and this
That,
we won't figure it out overnight. We can try, but it won't. It's a process.
but it's also the responsibility of media organisations and others that inform the community to deal with it appropriately as well. Um,
Agreed.
and then uh, social media companies and others are a bit of a different animal, but they've also got to be conscious of how they deal with things, and people need to look after their own intellectual well-being also. So you've
Exactly.
got a responsibility to inform yourself and understand how the world looks and what the world does.
Exactly.
Oh,
I would not agree more.
we're not gonna solve everything. No, it, it,
Not this one. Maybe on the next one, but not this one.
no, not on this one. No, no way. But there we are.
Well, thank you, Tom, for joining me again. I appreciate it, and I know my guests appreciate it too. You are welcome on Coffee and Conversations anytime, because we could just go on for hours. And thank you to everybody that has tuned in tonight. Much appreciated. And for all of you that are viewing this on Twitch, I am going to raid you out to Aquatic Cactus. He's playing Call of Duty Warzone right now. But if you guys want, stick around for a minute, give you a little bit of gaming. And I appreciate it. Thank you, Go Mental and Death of Certainty and Stuart. Thank you very much for tuning in, guys. Any last words tonight, Tom?
Oh, not from my end. I mean, it's been a bit of fun to talk again and to just explore some issues and look at ways of bringing a bit of common sense to the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And hold on one second. Technical difficulties. Where did it go? Hold on one second. Sorry. There it is. Sorry. Okay, it's not rating, but that's all right. Thank you guys again for everything. Much appreciated.